But since we are going to display the counter value in the count A widget and increase the counter every time the button within the count A widget is pressed, pass the counter and incremental function as arguments. And since one of the child widgets or middle widget are going to display the counter value, pass the counter. The count A widget receives an integer and void type function through constructor. To do that, declare an integer type counter variable and void function type increment function and create a constructor using the .data class generate extension. And change the 0 in the text widget with the counter it got through the constructor. On onPressed, assign a reference of the incremental function instead of an empty function. Then, every time the elevated button is tapped, it will call the incremental function. This means it will call the incremental function defined in my homepage. Passing the function reference to the child widget in this way and calling the function from the child is called inversion of control. But when I first saw this inversion of control, it didn't feel very natural to set up a mental model and follow it. It meant that it would pass the reference of a function and the function will be executed at that location. But I thought this was not very intuitive at first. The next is a middle widget, which is only there to pass the counter in the middle. Since the middle widget receives the counter value through the constructor, declare an integer type final variable counter and select the generate constructor to create the constructor. As you can see here, the middle widget doesn't need a counter itself, but counter v, a child widget, needs it. So it receives the counter from the parent widget and delivers it purely for the purpose of delivering it. Let's look at the counter b widget. Since counter b widget receives the counter through the constructor, declare an integer type final variable counter and select the generate constructor to create constructor. Replace 0 with the counter value received through the constructor. Let's do a hard restart, then learn it. Every time the increment button is tapped, the increment function of my homepage is executed. So the counter value of count A widget and counter B widget increases. It just seems like I complicated a simple app, but it clearly reveals the problem when there is no state management solution like Provider. The problem seems to be much cleaner when you can see it actually coded. First, a function is created in the parent widget and sent down, and execution is performed in the child widget. This is called inversion of control, and for beginners, this is not very intuitive. Anyway, in order to pass data and notify the children widgets when the data value changes, you have to define the incremental function in my homepage. Second, the middle widget doesn't need a counter value at all. It receives a counter value purely for the purpose of passing it to counter B. Third, whenever the counter value changes in my homepage, setState is called to reflect the change in the UI. If this happens, the widget tree under my homepage will be rebuilt. So there may be useless rebuilds, which will affect the performance of the entire app. If you simply increase the counter value without calling setState in the incremental function, the count increases, but it is not reflected in the UI. Fourth, logically, it is not easy to track because the rebuilding logic of the UI is in the upper widget, not the widget where the actual rebuilding takes place. For example, it is difficult to know where the rebuilding is taking place just by looking at the counter B widget. But what if the depth becomes deeper as seen in the picture? Yes, many widgets in the middle will need to receive method or data from the parent widget and pass it to the child widget just for the purpose of delivery. And if you move a specific widget to another location or insert a new widget, you need to change the code or insert a code that passes the data. It is a structure that is prone to errors and is very cumbersome. This makes me have a couple of questions. First, wouldn't it be nice if the data and functions that will be shared are defined in a widget on the widget tree, and the necessary widgets could easily access the necessary data and methods from that widget. And second, wouldn't it be nice if when the widget needs to be redrawn because of data change, it can be redrawn? The first thing, the ability to easily access objects in the widget tree, is called dependent injection in fancy terms. And the second thing is where the data and UI are synchronized. And in our app, setState does that. These functions are collectively called state management. In summary, a state management solution should have the function to easily access the data needed by the widget and the function to redraw the UI according to the changes data. But in Provider, they do not enforce a specific way to handle data that affects the UI, that is, the state. Flutter Block, Flutter Redux, etc. provide a specific way to handle a state other than the dependency injection method, and says that the developer follow the method. Meanwhile, Provider only provides a means to handle the state, but does not provide a methodology for how to handle the state. In summary, a provider provides a widget with an easy way to access non-widget data and methods. And when the data changes, the provider lets the widget that needs the data know that the data has changed, and when needed, makes it so the widget can be rebuilt. If you say this in other words, it's often referred to as separating the business logic from the UI. One of the peculiarities of Provider is that the provider itself is a widget. So you can embed a provider anywhere in the widget tree and use something like the .o method you have seen. This also means that Provider cannot be accessed from parent widgets or sibling widgets that are not Provider's child widgets. And since Provider is a widget, it has the advantages that you can learn a lot about the widget structure of Flutter. However, another aspect of the fact that Provider is a widget is that the provider is highly specialized for Flutter, so it cannot be used in other languages like Redux. Now then, let's start looking at Provider's aspects one by one, starting with a very basic example.